Florida State to the SEC, just inevitable. Is it done? The Board of Regents is trying to get out of there as quickly as they can. I don't think there are an awful lot of options right now. But let me ask you this. When Texas and Oklahoma just call up and they say, can I get Greg Sankey's office? And they say, may I ask who's speaking? And they say, this is the athletic director at the University of Texas. We want to join the SEC. And they hold, please. And they get Greg Sankey on the phone. So Greg Sankey has to say yes or he's fired, right?
Yes, I mean, but Greg Sankey did. I criticize the way he's handled some things, but he did use some leverage where he said you can't have the Longhorn Network if you join the SEC. We're not giving you that personal special treatment.
But it's a no-brainer, correct?
Right. Yes. Everybody criticized the SEC for doing it as if they would not have done the same thing if the Texas and Oklahoma called their conference.
Right. So if Florida State calls, is it a no-brainer?
Yes.
I think so too.
It's Florida State is an SEC school in the ACC. And for those that don't know, South Carolina was the consolation for the SEC in 1992. They wanted Florida State, and they wanted Florida State badly in 1992. And
Bobby Bowden came out. This is back when people didn't say such things publicly, and they're probably even more discreet now. He just came out and said, I don't want to go to the SEC because it's too hard. He said that publicly. Yeah. You might have been too young to remember that.
I remember him acknowledging it later in life, basically saying that like it's probably a good thing we didn't go to the SEC. I don't know if we would have been as good. I mean, he straight up said it. And
okay, so what schools then? Because the ACC's falling apart, the Pac-12's falling apart like literally on a daily basis. Literally, this is happening from day to day. Not even
they might be down to 4 teams by Saturday.
Yes. What teams would call that if you're Greg Sankey, you're taking, no doubt, period, end of discussion. We don't even need to finish the conversation, talk financial terms. I'll take you. And I know you mentioned they got him out of the Big Ten network, but sure, there would be little considerations to take care of. But ultimately, what are the teams that you would say, I'm taking you, we're finding a way for this to happen?
Well, there's 4 clearly, which is Florida State, and I've been saying this for a while, Florida State, Clemson, UNC, and one of the Virginia schools. You take them. And I know all 4 of them provide value to the SEC in the sense that they do actually bring in the revenue necessary to keep the SEC okay with its revenue distribution. And with UNC and one of the Virginia schools, you get a new TV market on top of that, which is still a factor. I know it's dying, but it's still a factor to a degree. The question for a while was, the rumor this week was Florida State might go to the Big Ten. But we just found out yesterday, I don't know if you saw this, Dave, the Big Ten is back on their train of reaching out to Oregon and Washington. And here's what I think is happening. Tell me if you think this is true or not. Oregon and Washington called the Big Ten and basically said, hey, we will accept less revenue sharing. We just want to get in your conference and get the heck out of that Pac-12. That's my guess of what happened.
I think that could very certainly be the case. And if that's the case, as much as I've ripped the Big Ten for going out and getting Southern California and UCLA, if they're able to get 2 more West Coast teams, and like you and I talked about, kind of create a AFC, NFC, East,
and
North,
get them for cheap too, because they'll take less revenue.
Yes, I think that's golden, and I don't think they were ahead of the game. I think they stumbled into that if that happens, but I think that's golden. But it takes me to Oregon and Washington. So if I'm Oregon and Washington, I'm going to make every phone call before I make a commitment. If they call the SEC, do you automatically take them? Do you talk about it, or is it a no-go?
I think if you're the SEC, you talk about it. And you have to negotiate with Oregon and Washington. And the reason you have to negotiate is travel expenses are still a thing, and time zones and like organizational structure of when games come out is still a thing. And that's the issue with the Big Ten just having USC and UCLA. And why do that with Oregon and Washington when Florida State and Clemson both bring more value, more brand value than Oregon and Washington? I argue that one of the that UNC and either of the Virginia schools bring a little more brand value than Oregon and Washington with their revenue. And you're still in a new TV market. The congruency is still there. So the travel expenses aren't the same. So I think that if you're the SEC, you want Florida State, Clemson, UNC, and one of the Virginia schools before you call Oregon and Washington. That's your top 4. And so and if you can't get them, then you maybe talk. But I think you hold out because I think we all agree that ACC is about to implode.
Yeah, it seems like it's about 2 or 3 years behind the Pac-12 in imploding. I think there's going to be 3 conferences. Credit the Big 12 for losing Texas and Oklahoma. They've managed to cobble together a pretty good conference, and the SEC and the Big 10 are the 2 best conferences. I think you're going to see, instead of the Power 5, it's going to be like a Power 3. Maybe bring in the Mountain West or some other conferences to make it a Power 5. I don't know what you do, but I think the Pac-12 is dead. I think the ACC is about 2 or 3 years behind it. So give me your schools that if they call, you take no matter what, end of the day. Rocky Top Tom said Georgia Tech. Buddy, I love the history aspect of that. And I think there would be recruiting advantages to being in Atlanta. But I don't see them being one of those schools.
Georgia Tech cares nothing about athletics anymore. For those who don't know, Georgia Tech has no brand value and they have no TV market value because Georgia is a bigger deal in Atlanta than Georgia Tech.
Okay, so you give me, we have UNC, Clemson, Miami, and Florida State, according to General Nealon. I don't think it's actually the general, but somebody that may be related.
General Nealon is close. 3 of those schools, he's right. Miami, I don't think the SEC has any desire to add Miami. There's really no – the Big Ten would because that's a TV market and they can have a recruiting base in Florida. It's Florida State and Clemson and UNC, and I say Virginia or Virginia Tech.
Here's my 4 that if I could magically add, it would be Clemson, Miami, Florida State, North Carolina.
You don't want a Virginia school?
That doesn't do as much. You brought that up before. It just doesn't do as much for me. I mean, I see your point, but I would like to see Miami because I think it's a good trip for fans. I would like to see Miami because if you let the Big Ten take Miami, that's a real recruiting foothold in the most talented area, period, end of discussion in the United States of America when it comes to college football. So I like Miami more. You and I agree on Florida State. We agree on North Carolina. Is that right?
Yeah, we agree on North Carolina.
And I think
but here's the ugly truth that SEC fans don't want to hear. UNC and Miami are AAU schools, so they're eligible for the Big Ten, and they would rather go to the Big Ten than the SEC because the Big Ten, I'm sorry, because of negotiations, has more to offer them than the SEC at this moment.
No, that's fair. I don't know that the academic standards, and you brought up the AAU thing, is going to be a big decision.
Well, that combined with the revenue distribution, though, the Big Ten is about to distribute much more revenue than the SEC, and that's going to be the case for the next 10 years. So, I mean, by the way, that's not devastating for the SEC because Florida State and Clemson can't go to the Big Ten, so the SEC can get them. And if UNC goes to the Big Ten, I think you can add NC State, and I don't think that's as much of a drop-off from UNC as people think. I think NC State is close to UNC in value. What about you?
No, I agree. My 4, like I said, Clemson, Miami, North Carolina, Florida State. But if you gave me the next 2, I'm about to go crazy, Tom. Okay? Virginia Tech, kudos to Rocky Top Tom because they are right across the border. And that's a semi-rivalry, actually.
That could be a Michigan-Ohio State rivalry in the SEC. Yeah. Tennessee and Virginia.
You want to hear the weird other one?
Where are you going?
Duke.
I think you're just but you're just thinking about success. But Duke as a brand, does Duke really bring in like TV revenue or any? Are people going to subscribe to the SEC network, for instance, if this goes to streaming just so they can watch Duke?
Well, I tell you what, if you put a Kentucky, Duke, North Carolina on Apple Television or whatever in the world the Pac-12 is doing, yes, I think people would subscribe to that. I think you would. What's the best right now? The best basketball conference is probably the Big 12 with the changes they've made. So if you could be the best basketball conference if you added Duke and North Carolina. I'm just. I know that's out in left field, and all the decisions are going to be made about football. I understand that I'm in crazy land, okay? But it's not as crazy when you think about it because suddenly you're the best football conference and you're probably the best basketball conference as well.
If you get Duke and North Carolina, you're right. You are the best basketball conference.
But they have to come together for the basketball argument. You can't just take Duke.
Well, and to be fair, UNC and Duke actually have contractual agreements, and this is the other part that people don't get. State legislatures in these states, these are public institutions, not Duke, but a lot of these are where they hitch their future to the wheel of the other school. So I think, for instance, I don't think Kansas can make any moves without Kansas State being protected, and I think that's with Washington and Washington State too. So, what do they do in that point? I mean, I think you and I are like, leave Washington State and Oregon State behind. Who cares? But I mean,
wouldn't it be weird for SEC fans that I think across the board dislike Duke because it's a private school to root for them in the NCAA basketball tournament? Because I tend to root for SEC teams in the basketball tournament.
Conference pride is dead. That's over. It's so
Right.
big now.
And it really just helps the other team recruit better.
Yeah, it's like rooting for the NFC East team in the Super Bowl if you're a Cowboy fan, or the AFC South team.
That's a pretty good point. And you're talking to a guy who thinks the Eagles should just be cut out of the NFL permanently because they're bad people.